Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is the 2024 election. Make sure to subscribe here on YouTube and the Undercurrents channel. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and of course over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Now, it is the day before Election Day. The polls are tied. Literally, they show a dead heat. This is a race between A, a former president, which is already unusual enough historically, and B, the sitting vice president who did not run in caucuses and primaries, but was instead nominated by delegates at the convention. It's a race between a reality star populist and a conventional politician, as every presidential race in this country has been since 2016. On top of all of that, the GOP nominee was shot in the head, leaving us millimeters away from an assassination. One party's candidate dropped out, the president. The other party's candidate was shot. Anything could happen over the next 48 hours, and indeed beyond them, as was the case in 2020, when we all remember the race was formally called the Saturday after the election, as outlets called the race in Pennsylvania. In 2000, as the election came down to Florida, Bush v. Gore wasn't decided until mid-December by the Supreme Court. Now, to put my own cards on the table, I side with Megyn Kelly, who said on this show just days ago that anyone who thinks they know what's going to happen is a fool. It's just too close and too unpredictable. Going into election night, though, we have two prior Trump presidential races as a guide. So we kind of know where to look for that guidance as votes start rolling in on Tuesday. I want to now walk through in today's episode 3 different sets of possibilities that we can all watch for tomorrow. And of course, you can do all of that as you're watching us here streaming. We're doing a fun late night Unheard stream for the wonkiest of the wonks. If you're up at midnight and you want to follow through until that thing is called, people already in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are saying they're not looking to have, or they're not expecting to have mail-in ballot totals until 2 or 3 in the morning, roughly. Similar to 2020, actually. When you have a race as close as it is, means it's going to be a late night, so we're going to be here with a great stable of guests, and you'll be able to watch us digest some of this as it's happening. But I want to start now with the battle raging between suburban and rural voters. Multiple Republican sources have told me their data show Trump is actually gaining ground in rural areas, which is sort of interesting, right? Because he's been such a constant variable. Now, these people don't seem jazzed about swing state suburbs, but they're basically betting that those rural gains will offset stagnancy in the suburbs for Trump. So where should we be looking? I would watch the WOW counties in Wisconsin and the collar counties around Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, both states where the polls close at 8 p.m. local time, and both states where mail-in votes were so high that, as we just mentioned, officials are expecting the counting process to take a while that night. Now, let's zoom in here in Waukesha County. Again, not just because it's where I'm from, but because it's one of those WOW counties in Wisconsin where Real Clear Politics currently has Harris up 0.3 in their national average. Wisconsin Public Radio zoomed in on the numbers recently. Quote, Republicans would regularly win Waukesha County with close to 66% of the vote in races for president before Trump's rise to power. In 2016 and 2020, Trump received just 60%. That analysis showed, and added, in raw numbers, 2012 Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney ran up the score in Waukesha County, winning it by more than 84,000 votes, even as he lost the rest of the state. By 2020, Trump's Waukesha County margin was about 56,000 votes, a 28,000 vote swing away from the GOP that was larger than the margin by which Trump lost the election. Now, one of those Republican strategists I mentioned recently actually told me just last week the factor that could save Trump in Waukesha is gains for him in those, quote, exurban areas that are more like rural communities, sort of in the western part of Waukesha County. You can just rinse and repeat this pattern in Ozaukee County, another WOW county, where Chris Stirewalt recently noted Trump went from winning by almost 19% of the vote in 2016 to just 12% of the vote in 2020. Now, that is a huge drop when the election is that close. And in a state like Wisconsin, it's also, I think, worth remembering, Biden may prove to be a stronger candidate than either Hillary Clinton was or Kamala Harris was. And this could be the case in Philadelphia's 4 collar counties. Just a couple of weeks ago, Former Philadelphia Mayor Michael Nutter put it this way, according to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He said that Miss Harris will also need to run up her totals in Philadelphia's 4 collar counties: Montgomery, Bucks, Chester, and Delaware. Hillary Clinton won all 4 counties in 2016, but didn't get enough votes to pad her lead, which sank her in Pennsylvania, he said. If Trump keeps Vice President Harris under 60% in those 4 counties, Houston, we have a problem, according to former Mayor Nutter. In Wisconsin, I'd also recommend paying attention to turnout in Dane County, which includes Madison, the University of Wisconsin, and a lot of young, newer voters who lean left. So turnout could be a critical indicator of how things are going for Kamala Harris as we start to see those numbers coming in on Tuesday night. Georgia and North Carolina are places where this urban-rural battle over turnout will be crucial as well, particularly as early voting is setting records in both places and even in rural areas that were tragically battered by Hurricane Helene. And the Dane County point is relevant here to North Carolina and Georgia as well, in that you have newer people moving to the Sun Belt areas outside of some of those major cities. Do they take areas that were swing districts or leaning pretty decently red and move them closer to the purple or Democratic category, just because you have more younger left-leaning voters who have moved down there since the pandemic and could really be making dramatic differences in both of those states, North Carolina and Georgia, where right now, according to the Real Clear Politics Battleground average, North Carolina, Trump is up by 1.4. In Georgia, he's up by 2.6. So the margins in those 2 states going into Election Day are not nearly what they are in other swing states, except for maybe Arizona, where Trump is up. Yeah, he's up 2.3 in the RCP Battleground average. He's only leading by 0.9 in Nevada, 0.3 in Pennsylvania. Harris is up 0.3 in Wisconsin and 0.8 in Michigan, according to RCP's Battleground state averages, on polling averages, that is to say. So he has a handy lead in those states, according to the polling. But we're going to get into this in a little bit. How accurate is that polling? In which direction is a critical question. So what I'm going to do here is pull up my map on this computer of the Electoral College and try out a few different possibilities for each candidate's pathway to victory. So on 270 to win right now, this shows where you have some votes up in the air. Those are the kind of brown states, and they're the obvious ones that we've been talking about. Those 7 swing states: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And they're obviously, to say something that we kind of all understand, they are the swing states because we don't really know with complete certainty which direction they're going to go, and they have enough Electoral College votes to sort of swing the election, unlike, let's say, there was something up in the air in Vermont where there are 3 Electoral College votes. Maybe not a crucial battleground, although every point is going to count, including Nevada's 6 Electoral College votes right there. Let's try something out. Let's go to that blue wall and let's turn Wisconsin and Michigan, let's just turn them blue, because that's where they are in the RCP average right now. So let's say Wisconsin goes blue. Let's say Michigan goes blue. That's 25 Electoral College votes right there. Now, let's turn Pennsylvania red. Let's say Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania. 19, a gargantuan 19 Electoral College votes in Pennsylvania. This puts Democrats at 238 and Republicans at 251. You need 270 Electoral College votes to win. Obviously, it says that right there on the screen because we're on the 270 to win website. So let's see. Donald Trump is up handily in North Carolina and Georgia right now. We'll turn North Carolina red. We'll turn Georgia red. And that puts Republicans at 283 votes in the Electoral College. That's enough to win, obviously, for Donald Trump. So he can potentially lose Wisconsin and Michigan, win Pennsylvania, and win the election. Well, let's, for the sake of it, let's give Nevada and Arizona to Kamala Harris. Trump is leading in both of these states right now, but for some reason, let's say the polls are off in Nevada and Arizona. Democrats, it is still not enough for them. This is the Sun Belt path, right? So we have the blue wall path, which is Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, kind of those Rust Belt states. But then you have the Sun Belt path, which goes through North Carolina, goes through Georgia, then goes through Arizona and Nevada. So let's say Donald Trump wins the Sun Belt path, as he's expected to do very well in Arizona and as he's expected to do very well in Nevada. So let's put these states in the red category, and let's then move Pennsylvania blue. So this is a scenario that has Kamala Harris winning the blue wall, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Trump sweeping the states where he's actually leading right now. What happens? Donald Trump still wins the election. If he holds on to Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina, he can lose the entire blue wall. He can even lose Pennsylvania, and he can still win the election. So the Electoral College map is obviously going in Donald Trump's favor in this scenario. That's where, based on the polling, where it is right now, that's pretty good for Donald Trump. And this is why you hear some chatter in Republican circles right now about a potential Trump landslide, because let's say he ends up winning Pennsylvania in addition to all of these Sunbelt states. Let's say he does it. Let's put Pennsylvania in his category. They're feeling like they are in landslide territory at that point, because then Donald Trump gets 300 votes in the Electoral College. And if he wins Pennsylvania, it's also likely he's going to do well in Wisconsin and Michigan, just because those have similar demographics, as many pundits see it. You say you have kind of the makeup of the state. You have these urban areas, you have these rural areas, you have the white working class. That's generally pretty favorable to Trump. So you can kind of make an assumption based on what happens in Wisconsin and Michigan about what happens in Pennsylvania. Now, that is not a safe assumption because the polls are so close. And that's why I think even doing the sort of map math, it's helpful to kind of know what to expect. I mean, for some reason, Donald Trump has been campaigning in New Mexico and Virginia recently, which would show a lot of confidence in your internal polling if, as the Republican candidate, you are trying to flip in the last days of the election, New Mexico and Virginia, where you're not looking great in the polling. It's not looking like a likelihood. He also campaigned in New York, and how many times did we hear people at his Madison Square Garden rally suggesting that maybe New York's 28 electoral college votes, like Pennsylvania's at 19, New York's 28 electoral college votes could go into the Trump category. Now, I'll just do it for the sake of it. Say New York goes for Trump. Then again, you're getting into landslide territory if New Mexico goes for Trump. This was about a week ago. Republicans were feeling even better about the possibility of that happening. So we're getting into 333, and you put Virginia in the Trump category. That gets into 346. Definitely landslide territory at that point. It leaves Democrats with only 192 votes. This is a sweep for Donald Trump. We would have to add Wisconsin and Michigan to that category for a full sweep, obviously, to the Republican category. But I actually don't think it's likely to say because Pennsylvania goes one way, Wisconsin and Michigan will necessarily go another way. I just don't think that's a safe bet. And I think the same thing is true with Nevada and Arizona, because recently we were looking at a CNN poll that showed Latino voters in Nevada and Arizona are interested in Trump and Harris in totally different margins. So Trump is doing much better with Latino voters in Nevada than he is in Arizona. And Democratic strategist said on this show, Chuck Rocha, that the reason is because you have a lot of service workers, Latino service workers in Nevada, who may be more amenable to Donald Trump's kind of populist economic message. So that is all to say, when you're in basically a statistical tie in so many of these races, it's just going to be really hard to extrapolate from one state or the other, because these small differences are just making a huge difference in the bigger picture, basically. All right, so let's put those possibilities aside, and I just want to show my map. I really do not want to make predictions in this election because it is a statistical tie. But for the sake of doing it while we're here, I think we're looking right now at Wisconsin probably going for Kamala Harris. That's probably, in my estimation again, but looking at statistically tied polls and, knowing Wisconsin as well as I do as somebody who grew up there, that's just my gut instinct. I actually, fun fact, interned for the Republican Senate candidate who seems to be losing to the Democratic incumbent, Tammy Baldwin, in the state right now. I just think the momentum is with Dems in this state, and I think Wisconsin was never a purple state, even though it elected Scott Walker over and over again and has elected Ron Johnson over and over again. It's just a pretty Democratic stronghold, even as rural voters are going increasingly for people like Ron Johnson. His races have been super close. But Kamala Harris, I don't know if she's more of a Clinton candidate or a Biden candidate. Suburban voters seem to be continuing to move away from Donald Trump. So that's where I'm just going to put Wisconsin in that category. Even so, some Republicans I've talked to feel okay in the suburbs. They don't feel like they're losing ground in the suburbs. It's hard to tell, but they don't feel like they're losing ground. They feel like they're just keeping ground in the suburbs, and it's just still Trump not being super popular there. Even so, I'm putting Wisconsin in the blue category. I'm going to actually put Pennsylvania in the blue category as well. Again, this is just my gut about where the momentum is in that state right now, but this is a tie. So I'm sitting here in this air-conditioned studio, except the air conditioning's not on because it would be too loud on the microphone, but it's a little warm, but it's as best as I can tell. I have done reporting trips to Pennsylvania during this election cycle. Just feel like the momentum is with Democrats there. In Michigan, I'm giving 15 electoral college votes to Donald Trump because of that Arab American contingency that is turning against Kamala Harris. National polls of Arab voters are showing that they are actually supporting Donald Trump. Donald Trump is we've seen in some polls, beating Kamala Harris with Arab American voters. He's gotten the endorsement of some imams, particularly in the area outside of Detroit. So will that be enough to swing it? Well, just before we came in here and started taping this, Michael Moore was on CNN talking about how when Hillary Clinton lost Michigan, it was by 2 votes per precinct in the entire state of Michigan. We are talking potentially about extremely thin margins. Kamala Harris right now in the Real Clear Politics national average, or in the Real Clear Politics Battleground Michigan average, is up by 0.3. 0.3. This is such a close race that when you're talking about even minor shifts in Arab American support for the Democratic ticket, it's significant enough that you can lose Michigan. And if I put Michigan in the Democrats category on this particular version of the map, which by the way is a very plausible version of the map, that gets them to 257 and lessens the pressure. But like I said, I'm putting Michigan in the Republican category just because of the likelihood that you get a big swing among Arab American voters, and that's just enough to be a huge problem for Democrats, where they would typically have a slightly easier time in the state of Michigan. Pennsylvania 19, going to Kamala Harris. I'm tempted to put either North Carolina or Georgia in the Harris category because I think she will pick up one of those states, just given people's migration patterns after COVID, given the possibility that even if early voting is up in rural North Carolina, areas that were battered by Hurricane Helene, same thing with Georgia, by the way, people are feeling pretty confident on the right that early voting in both of those states is a good sign in the areas that were hit by the hurricane that they believe might be favorable to Donald Trump. Even so, I think any hit to that rural vote, when you're depending on the rural vote, when you're depending on gains in the rural vote to carry you amidst those migration patterns outside of Raleigh, outside of Atlanta, that could be a real problem in one of those states. Now, if I was asked to say right now who I think would win Georgia or North Carolina, I'll say it is probably Donald Trump. But I'm really, really torn because I also think he's probably going to lose one of those states. So, Nevada, Arizona, I think Donald Trump has the momentum in those states. The Arizona Senate race is really interesting. Arizona, I'm going to talk about this in a moment, has abortion on the ballot, so that could be a huge problem. Kari Lake and the abortion referendum could be a huge drag on Donald Trump's numbers in the state of Arizona. So it's really anyone's ball game, and I know I keep saying that, but it is really anybody's ball game. I'm going to put Arizona and Nevada in the Trump category. He's leading pretty handily in the RCP battleground average right now in Arizona. Nevada is a little bit more up for grabs, but he's been hitting Nevada pretty hard. I think that race is just going to be really, really close, to be perfectly honest with you. So this has Democrats 242 and Republicans at 296. So this map looks like a Donald Trump win, which is interesting because my gut instinct nationally is that Kamala Harris is going to win the race. And that's why, when I'm forced to make decisions on all of these states, just based on where things look right now, I put individual ones in the Trump category. But the national vibes, to me, again, I'm here in Washington, D.C., where everybody is slobbering over Kamala Harris. The national vibes, I just, the momentum seems to be with Kamala Harris right now. I think sort of Beltway Republicans tend to overestimate because they've overcorrected for missing Donald Trump's popularity in 2016. I think some of that now is saying, well, everyone in Wisconsin who votes Republican loves Donald Trump. And this is just not the case, especially in those Milwaukee suburbs. And you can do the same thing with the Detroit suburbs. Same thing, of course, with the Atlanta suburbs and on and on. So that's my gut instinct. But when I'm forced to pick any of these states, I just think they're leaning in Trump's direction. You know, for the hell of it here, if I said I was going with Georgia for Kamala Harris, I mean, that's enough to make a really significant difference. It's enough to get Democrats within 12 electoral college votes. And let's say she takes Georgia and Nevada, the two states that I think are going to be, these are the two real toss-up states as far as I see it. So let's give her Georgia and Nevada. That puts Democrats at 264 and Republicans at 274. That's how close this thing is. And if, Nevada is any indication, or let's say if Georgia is any indication of what happens in North Carolina, then Kamala Harris wins the race. So that's how close this thing is. It is really just outrageous at this point. All right, so let's move on to number 3 here. Both Arizona and Nevada voters are also voting on abortion referendums on Election Day. These referendums have gone extremely well for Democrats since the Dobbs decision overturned Roe v. Wade. In 2020, some observers speculated that a snowstorm in Nevada was enough to cost Trump the state's 6 electoral college votes. That's how tight the margins have been in these states. Plenty of voters could split and vote for Trump and abortion. The ballot measures could also easily attract people to the polls who would not otherwise vote. That's great for Democrats if it boosts turnout, obviously, among Harris voters. Abortion is also on the ballot in 8 other states, none of which are really up for grabs in the Electoral College. And weed is on the ballot in 4 reliably red states. So this could potentially stave off a scenario where Trump wins in the popular vote but loses in the Electoral College. Or it could possibly turn out that the Joe Rogan demo Trump is gunning for splits their vote between the GOP candidate and left-leaning ballot measures. Let's pause, though, on that possibility that Donald Trump wins the popular vote but loses in the Electoral College. You could call it a reverse Clinton. It is not entirely out of the question. A couple of weeks ago, Republicans were feeling really good. And now I would put kind of the insiders in 2 camps. One is the camp where they think these polls being really close is fantastic for Donald Trump because they've been close. These margins have been narrowed and tightened in exactly the right time period for Donald Trump, which is the 2 to 3 weeks before the election, which, by the way, coincides with when Kamala Harris started doing a media blitz. That could prove to be the costliest error of her entire campaign and an unforced error as well. She easily could have gotten away with not doing all of those shows. She would have heard griping from journalists, but her momentum seemed to really stall. And I'm especially thinking of that Bret Baier interview, which went very, very poorly for her. Whatever you thought of Bret Baier, Kamala Harris did not come across well in that interview. And you cobbled together that with her appearance on The View, where she stumbled and she said she couldn't think of anything that would make her administration different than a Biden administration. That is a really hard message to sell when you're trying to be a change candidate as an incumbent in swing states. It just makes your job even more of a steep uphill battle. So that's really interesting in and of itself, and that's where Republicans are falling into these 2 camps, one of which is that they feel like the momentum in these states is on their side because Harris has had such a difficult last few weeks, and that has shown in polls, putting Donald Trump either within the margin of error of her in some of these states. Think about Michigan, think about Wisconsin, which could potentially give him the full blue wall, in addition to the Sunbelt states where he's already winning. That is, as Trump would say, landslide territory. So it's possible then that he could sweep totally what everyone is thinking because the polls are underestimating him and he has momentum that we saw show up in the polls right at the exact correct time. Now, to get to the scenario where he won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College, think if Donald Trump actually does run up his margin in states where he's not going to win the vote outright, so he's not going to get the Electoral College votes in New York. We talked about New York not long ago. So many Electoral College votes up for grabs in that state. But let's say he just runs up his margin of, like, let's say his margin of defeat is getting more narrow in a state like New York, where Black and Hispanic men in particular are really, really gunning in Trump's direction. So let's say that happens in New York. Let's say that happens even in Pennsylvania if he doesn't win the full electoral college, even in Wisconsin, reliably blue states like California. Let's say he ends up doing better there than people expect. It's not impossible that Donald Trump has a reverse Clinton scenario, has a narrow win in the popular vote, but loses the electoral college because Kamala Harris ends up doing well in the cities, in those swing states, where minority voters just turn out for her in bigger numbers than people predicted, and that's where maybe she's able to even do better than Joe Biden in some of those places, and turnout would be critical. What a wild possibility, but not one that's entirely out of the realm of possibility. So there's all kinds of things that could happen when you have basically a statistical tie with all of these states up for grabs. You don't know what's going to happen, so they can swing in either direction. There are a million different scenarios. So I just want to close with a recent point made by Nate Silver. He said, while the polls could be wrong again, and in fact they probably will be wrong to some degree, it's extremely hard to predict the direction of the error. Empirically, there's basically no correlation in polling error from one cycle to the next one. So we really just, when you have polls so close and you can't predict where the error is going to be, I mean, we always say the race comes down to one key demo or one swing county. It doesn't. It comes down to a combination of all of them. If one swing county in Pennsylvania turns out for Trump and one in Georgia turns out for Harris, pundits will say one lost it for Harris and the other lost it for Trump, or some mixture of that. Small changes in the youth vote or youth vote turnout could likely matter as much as small changes in the rural vote. If it comes down to any one thing right now, maybe it's Pennsylvania because of the sheer number of electoral college votes in the state, but others will say it's gender. This has been dubbed the gender gap election, with women making all of the difference for Harris if she runs up the numbers with women, or vice versa with Donald Trump for dudes. Did Joe Rogan make a difference? The truth of all of these things make a difference. And to Silver's point, we really just have no idea right now what's going to happen. So everyone is vying over these tiny slices of the pie, hoping to balance that message with each slice enough and get those slices without losing the other slices. It's a patchwork. It's about what voters are hearing and feeling on the ground in swing states, not what journalists in typically air-conditioned studios like this one are sensing in the vibe race. So we launched this show in the middle of the summer as this race was getting more and more chaotic every single day. Donald Trump had just been shot. We were careening towards a convention that was looking very unorthodox. There was question as to whether Joe Biden would remain on the ticket if he would remain president. And Kamala Harris ended up being the nominee. She was nominated at the convention. We were at both conventions. We covered both conventions. We've been to Pennsylvania. We've had conversations with voters. We've been to Trump rally, Kamala Harris rally. And after all of that, after all of the millions and millions of dollars that have been spent over the course of more than a year here in this country, we are so close. And we have had quite a time covering this race here on Undercurrents as a new show. Just want to thank you for tuning in and sticking with us as we try to cut through the sort of partisan noise that you see in a lot of other media outlets and force ourselves to be honest about our own biases and be honest about the biases of others and just look at the facts. Look at situating the facts in this bigger historical context and think about what's to come, not just here in this country, but in the West. These are huge questions, and it's an honor to work through them with our audience. So I just want to thank you for sticking with us. We're going to be here on election night doing a special late night broadcast, picking up the coverage as we expect things to heat up with mail-in votes being counted in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania into the early hours of the morning. We are going to be right here. So the best way to support the show and get premium content is over at undercurrents.tv. The best way to help on YouTube is to subscribe. Of course, turn your notifications on as well. That always helps. And just subscribe wherever you download your podcasts. I'm a big audio podcast listener. So if you're like me, subscribe there too. It helps us so much. Now, with that, just want to ask everyone, stay safe out there on election day. It's a very unpredictable time in the country, and we'll be back here with coverage of all of it very soon.